Hello. So this module is about the presidency and the executive bureaucracy. So it's chapter 7 and chapter 8. And chapter 7 talks about the presidency, some of the ideas behind the presidency, and the ability of the president to govern. So is varied in issues as the Brownlow report, all the way up to the 6 powers of the president. Now note that the 6 powers of the president is something that is unique to this class. If you look at the textbook divides the power of the president into his powers as head of state and his powers as head of government. However, I read a really interesting discussion of this by Ken Coleman, a notable political scientist, a few years ago, and he divided the powers of the presidency into, well, primarily 5 powers of the president, plus his powers, his political power. And a president often has his highest amount of power, his largest amount of political capital, immediately following an election. Why? Because it's a ratification of just how many Americans support him. And if you are a person who has been swept into office with him, the so-called coattail effect, then you are very excited to work with the president because he and your power bases are very similar. If you are from the other party, you're a little bit cowed because you know exactly just how popular this person is, or at least just how relatively popular as compared to your party this person is. Now, during the rest of the president's term in office, he engages in something called the permanent campaign, which is he continues to try to strive to keep his job approval high enough that his political supporters feel like they won't lose their job for supporting him. And his political opponents fear that they will lose their job for opposing him. So President Trump, most of his term in office, his job approval was fairly low. So it was probably high enough in most cases for most of his supporters to believe that in our district, the best way for me to keep my job is to stay on his side. But certainly it was never high enough for his political opponents who were in office to say, well, I'm in trouble in, New York City or Chicago or Seattle if I oppose the president, because the president wasn't very popular in any of those places. And so we had very divided government between the people who were elected to oppose the president and the people who were elected to support the president, both feeling like they had an argument. The other powers of the president, the ones that are most closely associated to his powers as head of state, are his diplomatic power and his power as commander-in-chief of the armed forces, which Coleman called his military power. So these are, as head of state, the president has his most power. The U.S. Senate in some ways engages the president's power as head of state by requiring their ratification of treaties that he that he would negotiate. Also, they need to approve the ambassadors that he nominates. On the other hand, we see today that presidents tend to not sign treaties. Instead, they make what are called executive agreements. In executive agreements, sometimes an executive agreement doesn't require any congressional action at all. If the president can, by an executive order or by his military power, just change something. The President of the United States moved the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem Trump did early in his term. And one of the reasons why he did this was because he felt that it would be politically popular with some components of society, and I guess it was. But he also wanted to show support for Israel, and in doing so, it didn't require any support. In fact, there were laws that were passed to already do this, and presidents had just decided to ignore it because they have diplomatic power. The president's military power. So if he makes an agreement with a foreign head of state to move a U.S. aircraft carrier into the Persian Gulf, it doesn't require congressional approval. In fact, even if the Congress in the 1970s passed something called the War Powers Act, which was designed to limit the president's power to unilaterally begin military conflict. He's supposed to inform Congress of the military operation, and after he's informed Congress, Congress is allowed to evaluate whether they want to continue. They want to have military operations continue or not. And what we often see is that Congress decides, no, we don't want to do this. But if they do, then they have to pass a resolution which the president can veto. And then if by 2/3 majority they override that veto, then military operations would have to end. In fact, Congress has been most successful ending military operations just by cutting off funding for it. The Vietnam War ended, for instance, when Congress said that they would not give any money for further operations in Southeast Asia. They had passed resolutions after resolutions, but when the money dries up, that's when, we also see that sometimes presidents can find money squirreled away to continue things for a while. But anyway, those two areas the president has the most power. Now, there's 3 other areas where the president has much less power. These are his power over the bureaucracy, which we call as executive, or Coleman called as administrative power. But I thought that was a little bit confusing in light of the fact that his other powers are his legislative power and his judicial power. So anyway, I'll give you a chance to look at that. There's a PowerPoint presentation that I think would be very useful for most of you. And then Chapter 8, in Chapter 8 we have the president, not so much the president, but the actual executive bureaucracy. The president ostensibly controls the executive bureaucracy, but what we see is that that is far from unchecked. In fact, many of the top bureaucrats have a closer connection to Congress, which is an ongoing relationship, rather than presidents who serve either 4 or at best 8 years. Presidents come and go, bureaucrats remain. You see this in the bureaucracy in many instances being able to block the attempts of President Trump to engage in policies that they felt were unwise or at least unpopular with them. When you look at the bureaucracy, you see also that their relationship with Congress is largely based on their efforts first to stay out of trouble, but second, their efforts to get funding. Congress has power of oversight, which is enforced largely by their power to authorize activity, and secondly, their power to appropriate money. And so Congress determines the powers. Remember, the executive branch, according to the Constitution, has 2 officials, the president and the vice president. Every other executive branch official is serving in a job that was created by Congress, or at least broadly created by Congress. There's no law that says there'll be a guy who cleans the floor at the Kansas City field office of the FBI. But on the other hand, that there is an FBI and what the FBI does and how it's structured is all determined by congressional activity. And then finally, due to the Administrative Procedures Act, there is a formal process by which courts could interpret decisions of the bureaucracy. So even though the president, and he does have a lot of power, first his primary power is that he appoints the political leaders of all of these bureaucratic agencies. So there's career officials, but then there's also the people at the very top are his appointees. Second, and probably most important, is the president can issue what are called executive orders. And they're directives to the bureaucracy on exactly what to do, on how they should make the rules for interpreting laws. And they might resist him. But over time, presidents are often able to move the ball a little bit. So anyway, Chapter 7, Chapter 8 are of particular use, are particularly interesting, I think. It gives us a chance to step away. We actually are going to be talking about Max Weber, somebody who lived 100 years. In fact, Max Weber died in the Spanish flu. I guess today we would call pandemic. I don't know. I think that's a neologism relative to the Spanish flu. And so if you look at his 6 characteristics of a bureaucracy, we're going to be doing a lot of work with that. So we'll maybe get to talk about a little bit more detail when we talk about public opinion, elections and campaigns, and political parties. I wish you all a great deal of good luck, and I hope the semester's going as you'd hope.